Just going to give everybody, as you guys are coming into the room here, hello, hello, as we're welcoming our people into our Zoom room here. We're going to just take a few moments and make sure everybody on Facebook and everywhere else can see us. So just hold for just a moment and we will get started. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're so thrilled to have you guys joining us for our what is now weekly author event series, virtual series we've been doing since April. And we've been trying to do every Monday and Thursday. One, to just give you something to look forward to, have something on the schedule that you can count on every week. That's not a bummer, not a downer, something where you can break away from the news cycle and talk about books and culture and all the different things that we've been doing here over these past few months. And it's been great to stay connected with all of you, our fans and readers and customers and everyone else out there. And also, you know, one of the cool things, I guess, about this virtual experiment that we've been living in for the past 6 months or so has been reaching a lot of new people. There's a lot of people who may never have been to Tulsa or may not know about Magic City Books or anything. And we're really having a good opportunity to connect with you. Last night, we did an event with the U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, and had a lot of people watching from all over the country. And you know, that kind of reach is something that is a pretty special thing for us. So thank you for watching. We have a lot of virtual events coming up through the end of summer and into the fall. I won't go through the whole list, but we're gonna be doing these for a while. I would imagine we will not be doing any in-person events probably until 2021, if we're going to be realistic about that. But I do hope that we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to try to do a few outdoor literary happenings. Obviously, a lot of authors are not traveling right now, but we have a lot of local authors that are just not having an opportunity to connect with anybody right now. So we might try to do some local author book fairs, maybe out in the park or somewhere that's socially distanced, where we can try to do something safe, but also keep you guys connected with what's going on. A couple of things coming up on this Sunday, August 30th at 2 p.m. We're going to be doing a talk with Hannibal Johnson for his new book called Black Wall Street 100, which is a new book looking at the upcoming centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and of course, looking at the history of Greenwood and what was known then as Black Wall Street. So that's going to be 2 p.m. this Sunday, August 30th. And then the last one I'll tell you about is a ticketed event that we have coming up. Most of our events are free and open to the public, but we do have a few ticketed ones. And we do have Margaret Atwood is going to be joining us on September 8th. She's going to be doing 4 events around the country, and we were lucky enough to snag her for this one. So that's going to be a pretty exciting opportunity, and I'm not one bit nervous about interviewing her for that. So it's not as if she's like talking to like Cheryl Strayed and Ann Patchett and all these amazing people, and somehow snuck in there. So I'm excited about that. But tickets are on sale. They're going pretty quick. And it does include a signed actual book, no book plates or anything. She's actually signing 500 copies of the new book for us. So get in on that if you can. You can go to magiccitybooks.com. Tonight, I'm really excited. You know, one of the things that I've always loved, we've been doing our author event series since 2009. And I've had a long enough time to have seen a lot of debut novels and other things kind of come across the threshold. And, you know, some of them, you know, when you pick that book up, that you're reading something special. I remember we did an event early on with someone like Emily St. John Mandel, for example, and you could kind of just tell from reading even her pre-Station 11 books that there was just something there that was going to catch on. So when I got a chance to read Daniel Hornsby's book, Via Negativa, it was like one of those wow factor moments. You know, the thing I'm always looking for when I read a new book is exactly that, something new, something fresh, a voice that seems like something I don't know, and maybe a topic or a world that I'm not familiar with. And this book really, it would be, I guess, a cliche at this point to say it's kind of one of the most exciting debut novels of the year, but it really is just that. Unfortunately, coming out in a really weird ass time that we live in right now. But it really kind of knocked my socks off reading this book. And also, gosh, you know, we're talking about Catholicism. We're gonna get into that a little bit. good timing with all the things happening. We had a lot of good mentions about Catholicism at the old RNC last night. So it's good topics. I don't think Lou Holtz will be joining us tonight, but we'll see. I may be watching. But I also love an opportunity to take a back seat and actually watch some of these and enjoy it. So handling our conversation tonight is going to be another author that I've really enjoyed, who's just, we're going to be talking about an essay collection tonight called The Unreality of Memory, which I could not recommend strongly enough. But I would also encourage you to check out Elisa's poetry, her criticism. And I've been reading so much poetry over the last 6 months. It took me a while to get back into reading. I think everybody at the beginning of the pandemic thought, I'm just going to read like crazy. But I kind of had this moment. It lasted for weeks where I really could not get into books the way I usually would be doing. And poetry was the thing that I kind of turned to as kind of a salve, or I don't know what, but it was just kind of always there for me. And I was in kind of small enough bites where I could do that. And if you haven't read Elisa's poetry, definitely do that. But also we're going to be focusing on the unreality of memory, but backlist is always important. So Elisa and Dan are going to be in conversation tonight about their two wildly different books. This could not be a more eclectic pairing that we have tonight, but that's going to be the great part about it. So we're going to have a conversation. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes. If you guys have questions, and I hope you will, we ask you to put those into our Q&A function here on Zoom, and we'll incorporate those as we go. And then most importantly, buy these two books. We're doing a special tonight. I just found out from our administrators. It's 2 books for the price of 2, one night only. We never do this, so take advantage of that. We're going to be putting links to buy the books in the chat function here. So we'll do that as the conversation happens. If you miss it, sometimes these get lost. So we'll be reposting those opportunities to get the books. Buy them through Magic City Books. We're a nonprofit bookstore. Every dollar you spend goes back into things like this, programs that we can do. It goes back into the community, and we appreciate your business. So I want to say thank you for watching, and a huge thank you to Dan and Elisa for joining us tonight. And I'll turn it over to Elisa to get our conversation going.
Thank you, Jeff, for that great introduction. I related to a lot of that, not being able to read at the beginning of lockdown, 100%. I also found that I could concentrate more easily on poetry. There's something about just fewer words on the page kind of brings your mind into focus. And I was having a lot of early wake ups. I would sort of wake up around dawn and couldn't go back to sleep, but that's maybe the best time to read poetry. I was reading a lot of Rilke, and it was just sort of like I would see the sun come up, and it was just so bleak. It was great. Like the bleakness made me feel better. I'm really excited to talk to Dan about his great novel, Via Negativa. This was actually one of the first books that I read while I was in lockdown. I got my copy. It was within, the first few weeks of lockdown, and it was just the perfect book to read right then. I thought it was so kind of companionable, like being so close to this very wise character. And it was sort of like, it's sort of easy to read in a way because it's a short book and it's really approachable. And, like the prose is very lucid. But it is still so intelligent, and I think that's hard to do. So I love that. I love that voice. But so I wanted to start with the character, just talking a little bit about Father Dan. Yeah. One thing that I think is really interesting about him is that, okay, so a lot of times when, there's a first person narrator, it bears some resemblance to the author, especially when they have the same first name. A lot of people take that as like an immediate clue. Oh, this is autofiction. So this is clearly not autofiction because this is like a priest in his late 60s. Right. So I just want to hear a little bit about, what was the origin of this character for you, and like what cheeky game were you playing by calling him Father Dan?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, with names, I feel like you can go a couple different routes. I guess for me, like a challenge was like writing a narrator who had a very different life than mine in a lot of ways, and who was much older, right? Like 40 years older than me. And so I wanted to like really create a personality on the other side of the page that had someone with interest, somebody with like weird little fascinations, skills they picked up, you know, like when they were 50 or 60, you know? And it was easier for me to do that at first if I just called him my name. I know it's like so indulgent. And so I did that kind of as a trick, where I could just like really identify with him and kind of like put some of my ideas in there and then slowly kind of build the scaffolding of a character around that. And then once I got to a point where I'm like, well, his name is Dan. Okay, that works. Like about 25% of the like, you know, Irish Catholic priests of his generation are named Dan. There's probably another like fourth are Mikes. There's some like Johns, you know, but like it just worked texturally for me. And it just kind of stuck that way. And then I liked that like there are so many kind of works of autofiction out there that I thought it would be kind of funny and playful to just like keep it and let there be some kind of strange, you know, other me. When I was a kid, there was a priest who like picked me out and was like, you should be a priest. And so I kind of like this parallel universe version where I like did or didn't do that. I mean, he's not me. He's very different than me in a lot of ways, but I kind of like that as this, you know, one universe over in the cosmic duplex, there he is, you know?
I love that. I love when things are kind of like placeholders or, you know, things that you mean to change, and then they just, for whatever reason, you get attached to them and then they don't change. I think that's great.
Right.
Did you have the idea for the character first or the story first, or did they kind of come to you at the same time?
Yeah, so there was a family friend who was a priest who, for a while, as a kind of experiment, was living out of his car. And I just heard that, like my mom told me that he was like taking this on. And so at that time I was reading The Way of a Pilgrim, you know, the 19th century Russian text with an anonymous author. Salinger riffs on it a lot. And I like the idea of a pilgrimage. I was reading some like Fanny Howe as well. She has that kind of long sequence called Catholic. And I liked just like the way that I liked the language there. I found it deeply hypnotic. And I wanted to find a way to kind of like render a pilgrimage in that kind of language as best I could. I mean, it's Fanny Howe, what are you gonna do? So they just kind of merged, and I was like imagining like, okay, this priest doing that, it's like, it is so much like the Desert Fathers. It is so much like the kind of anchorites of that, you know, in Lower Egypt in the 3rd and 4th century, going out on your own into a kind of wilderness. And I was able to, you know, it's like I've lived in Indiana, I've lived in Kansas, I've made that drive up to Seattle before. And so it just became kind of, that became the book, you know, those different things I was into, I realized I could just kind of group them all together into one thing and pour as much of myself into it as I could.
Yeah, I was going to ask about research, because for those who haven't read it, it's like a road trip novel. And so it's interesting that you say that you've kind of been there before. Did you do it all from memory, or did you go on a road trip to refresh your memory?
Yeah, you know, it's like I was in a band in college and we did that route all the time.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of Google Maps, because it's like, I didn't want somebody who's like Alice's dad has made that drive so many times. I didn't want someone like him being like, you could not get to Denver in this much time, or you couldn't get to St. Ignatius, you know, Montana in 2 hours. So I did a lot of Google Maps to be like, if he leaves at this time, is he going to wind up here at the right time? Maybe he should stop here, and then the sun will be coming down. That'll be kind of a cool image. You know what I mean? Like this kind of landscape choreography, you know? Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the Catholic stuff was just kind of absorbed from divinity school, my own obsession with this kind of Via Negativa tradition, this loose tradition.
I loved learning about that. Yeah, I love how there's this whole kind of education. I don't know anything about that or Catholicism, so I love that kind of, you know, not preachy, ironically, I guess, right. way that you learn about all that through reading the book. So thinking about the narrator again, I want to ask you a couple of kind of like sort of wonkish, I guess, fiction questions.
Sure, yeah.
So
and you write a lot about fiction, so this is interesting to me. I've read a lot of your blunt instrument stuff too, and obviously the word pretty and stuff. So
yeah, I love writing about fiction, thinking about how people write fiction, even though I don't write it myself. So
do you ever think you will write a novel or short stories or anything like that?
It seems crazy that I wouldn't, because like I'm a writer and I love fiction so much, but it just I never have fictive ideas. Like it never occurs to me to sit down and try to write a story at all.
That's interesting, because I think like nonfiction and fiction are in this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
But it's like, obviously the first novels are like stealing all these forms from nonfiction. The third person is just kind of ripped from newspapers, right? Like, I don't know. It will happen. I don't know.
Well, there's a whole tradition, of course, of like the poet's novel, and I love reading poets' novels, and of course I love like very essayistic fiction as well. So like there's no strict reason why I couldn't do it, but it just like I said, I just never have an idea for a piece of fiction. Maybe someday, we'll see. But yeah, so there's this part that I kind of reread the book, like I reread it really quickly because I read it long enough ago, and just the way time has been this year, it was like my mind was erased and I couldn't remember the details, and I wanted to remember like the little scenes, because it really is such a great scene novel.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I love that. Like you're in this cafe, that's one of the great things about a road trip novel, is like it's built for like a succession of scenes. But so, and like every time I read them, I was like, yeah, with the well.
Right.
And it all came back to me. But yeah, so there was this moment where it's the beginning of a chapter, and he says, he's this first person narrator, he says, I haven't been completely honest with you, which is to say me. And so that kind of raises two questions at once, right? Because all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, is Father Dan an unreliable narrator? But if so, like, why is he admitting it? And also it kind of raises the question of like, what kind of document is this? How like early novels would always have this weird framing narrative where they would try to like fool the reader into thinking that it was like a diary or something that was like found on
like
a shipwreck.
Roxana or something like that.
Yeah, and it kind of forces you to question that, like, oh right, like what is a first person novel? Like where is this document coming from? Is this his internal monologue that he's thinking while he's driving? Is this literally like his diary? Or of course it doesn't have to be any of these things, but what did you think of it as?
Sure. Actually, that's really funny, because it kind of like bleeds into some of the process stuff, just how the book came about. So there's this, I think 14th century mystic named Margaret Atwood, who she wrote about like, maybe we don't need the sacraments, so maybe we don't need priests. Maybe you can have divine union without some of the structure of the church. So obviously she was murdered by the church for that. And, for a long time, they didn't have any of her texts, but they were popular. Like people were into it. And eventually they actually were able to cobble together most of her work from breviaries, these little prayer books. People would copy a psalm here or a little bit of scripture there. And like embedded kind of in these kind of pseudo diaries would be like whole paragraphs of her work. Just for, be for a monk or a nun's, just spiritual edification. And so at first I kind of imagined it as like him in the kind of white pages before and after, like the collected writings of Origen, the sermons of the Venerable Bede, doing that himself, and that it would kind of, like this was a little bit of her own diary, which is part of the kind of dispatch mode. So things kind of happen, and it's like the kind of point of reflection often is like that day or that night.
Yeah,
right?
I was going to ask you about that too. Did you see me having this conversation like when I was reading the novel on Twitter?
I saw you tweet about it, and I was like, oh, that's why.
This like I was asking around because again, like because I'm not a fiction writer and I haven't taken any fiction classes, I don't necessarily always know the sort of terminology that people who like have an MFA in fiction have. And I was wondering if there was like an official term for that kind of tense. And I invented in my head, I called it like a dispatch tense, where it's like, you're getting these past tense passages, but it always feels like the point of telling is very close.
Yeah, and for me, that just, eventually it's like that was scaffolding that didn't really need to be there. I think there's some, like the fact about Marguerite Perret is cool. But like that as a thing, because it's like, I couldn't, you know, the like moment of storytelling couldn't be distant from the road trip, because then you would know kind of what became of him.
Yeah.
And also it would create a kind of compounded distance, because a lot of it is, you know, in retrospect anyway.
Yeah.
So I wanted a kind of material, physical, day-to-day road trip stuff to be very embodied and very close, and occasionally dip into the present tense, because I think that's kind of fun, right?
Yeah.
Just to kind of, because you're like, I'm so sore, I just did this thing. You know what I mean? Like there's a kind of like embodied telling there.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really smart, because as you say, it allows him to kind of reflect back without there being this double reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually that, another thing I wanted to ask you is about like just that sort of micro genre. I think of it as a micro genre of people like late in their lives reflecting back on their life.
Yeah.
Which is something that I really like, either in fiction or in nonfiction. You know, it can be a memoir or it could be a novel, and that's just something I'm always really fond of. Is that something that you are too?
I am, yeah. And it's like, it's not super glamorous to like have old characters, right? They're not hot. And,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, that is a part of it. Like, it's like with movies, like we want to look at hot people. We don't have time for old people in movies, apparently. But like, so I like that. And I like having like a textured and layered life that, you know, so that things can kind of conjure memories and have this like associative property. But there are also a lot of cliches to that, right? Like Alice and her MFA friends call it like the old bones story, where it's like, you know, it's like, all my friends are gone, my hair is gray, I ache in the places where I used to play, kind of thing. Where it's like, oh, I can't get up these stairs anymore. And then there's like oblique references to like a dead spouse, you know? But, you know, cliches are great because they're just opportunities to kind of do something else. Like, and so that was fun for me. But like The Remains of the Day is one of those where you have like, and honestly a huge influence for me because it has like Ishiguro is like the master of that kind of negative mode, right?
Yeah.
Like his novels are almost entirely in a kind of negative space. And you're seeing over, you know, I think Mr. Stevens, he's the narrator, you're seeing over his head, and there's a kind of like very particular sadness to that. It's like when Leonard Cohen, this is another Leonard Cohen reference, but he's like, that's all, I don't even think of you that often. You like know that he thinks about the person he's addressing all the time. You know, it's almost more honest and direct by way of negation.
Yeah.
Which is a big part of the structure of the book.
Yeah. There's that 80s song too. I ain't missing you at all.
Right, exactly.
Same mode.
Exactly.
Sadness is good because I wanted to ask you about loneliness. You know, I think, you know, certain books, like not through our conniving or choice, seem especially relevant now. I've been getting this question a lot, obviously, because I wrote an essay about pandemics. But I think the kind of angle about loneliness in this book is really interesting to read now, because like we're all, I don't know, surely we're all lonelier than we've ever been, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I found that kind of aspect of Father Dan's character very poignant, because, you know, there's certain parts where he says like, oh, he wears the collar, even though he's like almost sort of not technically a priest anymore. That's arguable, because when people recognize him for what he is, they come up to him and they sort of volunteer like their miracles, like the weird shit they've seen, or they want to make a confession maybe. So yeah, there's that, and there's another kind of driving emotion in the book I'll ask you about afterwards. But I just wanted to see if maybe you could like riff on loneliness for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always captivated by people who just like hit the eject button in life and go off and chase some weird thing, right? Like that's just so compelling to me. I think it's like, I mean, you know how it is, like with writing, there's a little bit of that, but my life isn't very radical in that way. And I'm always like a musician who just like decides they're gonna like be Prince. You know what I mean? Like do it. And I can't get enough of those kinds of stories, you know. But there's also a kind of like cop out that comes with that, especially in pursuit of a kind of like mystical experience. Like he wants to be a priest, he opts out, and he uses that all of the time to kind of not be present, to not be accountable in his relationships. So he's somebody who's like has a lot of like he has actual power, right? Like as you know, if you try to get married in the like pretty Catholic church buildings, they'll make you sit down with a priest. Like they wield that, you know. But also, so he can kind of like wobble in and out of like, oh, I'm on my own and I'm by myself and I don't have a family, and then he's like part of this other family with this couple, or he's you know, with his friendship with Paul, which is a huge part of it. So it's this kind of wobbling where it's like he uses, kind of weaponizes the loneliness that comes with that. And I think now that he's old, he realizes like there's a cost to that. And I think he really craves, you know, the kind of transformation that can come from living with people and being accountable to people.
Yeah, so which brings me to the other, I think, kind of prevailing emotion of the book, which is guilt. And I also think that this is kind of maybe where our books have the most overlap, is through this kind of trying to figure out what to do with guilt, like what is it good for?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be not just an important question in our books, but just like a question that people I know are asking, you know, maybe especially white people, like this like white guilt that you hear a lot about is like, it's very real. Like, where does it come from? What is it for? What's the point of it? Is there any use value to this guilt? Can we like convert it into something meaningful, or is it almost just vanity?
I know. Yeah. I mean, you talk about this a lot in ways more interesting than I'm going to say here, but I think like guilt can be a very selfish thing, you know, like it's this kind of, you're like, you stew in it. It's like one thing that my wife Alice, the brilliant essayist, says, and I think this is maybe from Jack Kornfield or something, but I've carried this around with me for a while, is like, it's not your fault, but you are responsible. Like, you know, like we're not blaming you, but you have responsibility. And I feel like that is ethically like makes sense to me, that there's a kind of imperative to action, but it shouldn't be about you staring at your belly button, figuring out like how you feel about things. You know, it's like you actually have and I think for Dan, like he engages in that, you know, because there are a couple of varieties of guilt that are famous, and Catholic guilt, it has to be one of the most kind of exquisite vintages. But he, you know, and a lot of that is like, you know, if you think of like Augustine's Confessions, like that's a lot of text just like about about me, you know, and it's even like him as a narrator, I think is like him kind of dwelling on in storytelling in this way, and he kind of misses the boat sometimes. Like he should be helping people, he should be with people, and instead he kind of savors his own sadness.
Yeah. Wait, I'm gonna quote another line from your novel. It's when he goes to this trip. It's a flashback, but he's thinking about this trip he took to Haiti. And I think I also posted this on Twitter when I read it, but it was, I'd chosen unimaginable horror so I wouldn't have to reckon with imaginable pain. I think that's great.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the Haiti stuff, there's like, someone who read the book had like more of an evangelical background. And he's like, oh, the Haiti thing, I get that. Like the mission trip mentality. of Christianity, like in America. It's like, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think for him, it's like he gets to kind of like imagine the pure extreme of someone else's pain, and then he doesn't have to help, you know. And I think a lot of us do that.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a lot of what I was writing about, is just this sort of, it's almost a fantasy that things are beyond repair, so that then you're absolved of all responsibility, because it can't be fixed, can't be helped. It's just suffering.
Right, and you talk about that because you're a writer, you work a lot, right? I listened to your interview with Brad Listy just as a little prep for this, even though I know that's kind of old. But like, you're like, because I think you were kind of thinking about some of this stuff when you were talking with him. But like, what is like how much activism should you engage with? How useful are you as an activist? Like showing up somewhere. Are you more useful like as a writer? Do you know what I mean? Like that kind of negotiation is so interesting.
Yeah.
I do have a question about the unreality of memory, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the things that really stuck with me, I still think about it, it's like when you talk about your own face and the kind of like sides of your face. And maybe I've been thinking about it because of like author photos and Zoom. But I was just wondering if you could like, what brought you there? And do you like, especially with Zoom stuff, like do you think about that? Like that's one of the prescient for me in this weird way, not just the pandemic stuff, but I'm like looking at my own face and being like, did I turn my hair on? You know what I mean? So can you just talk about that a little bit more and how you got, like, what led you there? Because to me, that's like horrifying. Like the idea of writing about my own face terrifies me.
Yeah, I agree. I've also thought about how that essay has sort of new relevance that it didn't occur to me at the time. It was just, I mean, I've just always been interested in like the self, like how we construct a self, or conceptions of the self. The second book I wrote, which is sort of like poetry essays, essayistic poems, is called The Self Unstable. So this is just like one of my kind of forever topics or obsessions that I write about a lot. And so, yeah, I had read this book called The Ego Tunnel by a cognitive scientist named Thomas Metzinger. And it's all about how he has this theory that like the self is basically this very immersive user interface. And so like your mind like constructs the world based on, you know, like whatever limited data you have, and makes it look realistic, like very immersive virtual reality. And your mind also constructs a self model to like be your avatar in that world. Right. And to you, it's so immersive. It feels like you're actually living in the world through your body. But in fact, everything is happening in your brain. And so, and there's all these interesting theories about like, you know, sort of what happens with that self model, which is that like it can kind of like glitch out and replicate. So if you have an out of body experience, you like when you feel like your soul is leaving your body, it's like you have a projection of your self model that looks down on your real body. And you know, but like a sort of more everyday version of that would just be that like when you kind of have a like a special memory or like you're just fantasizing about something that you would like to happen, you kind of see it happening in the third person. Like you watch yourself walk up on stage to collect your National Book Award instead of like imagining yourself.
Lucas, hi.
Yeah, you sort of like see it from a distance. And so I was really interested in this idea, and then I just started having all these kind of other sort of revelations. And it was probably because when I wrote that essay, I was like in my mid-30s. And, you know, that's for anyone who's younger, I'm sorry to let you know, Dan, you're younger. For anyone who's older, you'll remember that's like when like really like your face starts to change like fast, like faster than you can keep up with it. So like, I mean, you start aging, and in this way you're just like, wait, what is wrong with my face? Why does it look totally different than the way I picture myself? And then like the second you get used to it, it's different again. So you can't keep up with yourself, and you're just constantly like, why do I look so weird and old and bad?
Right.
Yeah. So like, I think that's partly why I was obsessed. And so I just found all this interesting research about kind of mirror images and how people feel about their own photographs. And I just got really like mired in it. And yeah, that's really all come up again now that like we're all doing these Zoom calls or even just like FaceTime more often, and you have to see this image of yourself, and it's really haunting. And so many people I know are like having crises of the self, maybe not so much anymore, but like a few months ago, they were having these crises of the self about it because they were like, I can't believe that's what I look like. And I'm like, well, it's not.
I know.
It's not really what you look like to anyone else.
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny because it's like that kind of idea of like, that we kind of come, like we think of mirrors as like this way into like self, not like you see yourself, and we use that as a way to kind of like classify animals to see if they're intelligent. Like, do they have a self? Because do they recognize the idea of a self as it appears to them in the mirror? What's weird about like the Desert Fathers, like, the word like Gnostic really comes from gnosos, which is like this like idea of like knowing yourself, right? But these people are alone, way more alone than us. So some are in communities, and they're not looking at mirrors. Like they're like in caves, and they're like, so it's like a weird kind of like that you need. Yeah, I think about people like who lived without mirrors. Yeah. And like, how would you picture yourself without mirrors and photographs? Like, how would that conception be if that wasn't even a thing you could imagine?
Have you ever seen Quantum Leap, that 80s show, or maybe it was early 90s?
No, I haven't. I know about it.
So like the premise. So like at the beginning of every show, because the idea is that he's like time traveling to fix some flaw in the past, but he'll end up in somebody's body, and it could be anybody. And so he doesn't know who he is until he like finds a mirror and looks in it. And sometimes he's a woman, sometimes he's really young, sometimes he's really old. Yeah. But yeah, like I always think like, what if you could do that? Like, I guess, maybe you had like some very special kind of amnesia, but like, what if you could like look at yourself in the mirror for the first time and you have no baggage about your face and your body because you don't associate it with selfhood, which is like toxic. And it's just like, it's like you're seeing a stranger. Like, what would you think about yourself if you could have that just completely blank slate view of a mirror image?
I think about that with fiction all the time, because it's like students will always be like, I looked in the mirror, my hair was shiny and black, my cheekbones were high, and you know what I mean? And it's like, but there is kind of a problem of visualization with characters, especially if you're spending a lot of time with them. Like when I was a kid, I would read and I would imagine like for a while, like if someone's name was Peter, they had like a large P-shaped neck and head that like some of the, if their name was Fred, they had like weird kind of peninsulas growing out of their face. For just like a weird period of my childhood when I was kind of like figuring out how to like, visualize what I was reading,
I love that.
But that is a problem because you're like, because like I live with my face. So like if I were telling a story, I'm not going to be like, this is my face. Unless I might do some kind of thing where it's like, you probably want to know what my face looks like. It's got a weird mustache that makes me, you know what I mean? Like I would. Yeah. I don't know. But anyway.
Well, yeah, one of the parts of that essay that I still think about is like, it's just the fact that you sort of, you tend to prefer your mirror image because you're used to it. And so then you see a photograph, which is not your mirror image, it's the opposite. It looks really weird and like uncanny. But so everybody has that, but like everybody else prefers your actual face, those who know you, to your mirror image. So like when I see my husband, John, like when we're standing next to each other in a mirror and I see his face in the mirror and I know that that's the face he prefers, I'm just like, ew, that face is all wrong. Like, I like your normal face, the face that's in photos and that I see.
Right. It's related to names. It's related to like how your name sounds to you and how it feels to say someone else's name,
It's very true. It's very true.
That's cool.
Wait, I see maybe one question in the Q&A.
Okay,
Let me just, do we? Ooh, yeah. Oh, I'm happy about this question. Dan, what a great read. Do you ever experience Acidia during the writing process? Am I pronouncing that right?
I think it's Acidia.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's absolutely not what I thought it would be.
No worries. I know. I like said it weird for a while anyway. So
yeah. Cool. define it for those who don't know before you talk about
Yeah,
it?
so there's this guy, his name was a Vagrius Ponticus, or a Vagrius of Pontus. This is just a fun tangent that you'll like, I think. But, you know, in the like kind of early Christian world, a lot of these monasteries in Lower Egypt were financed by wealthy Roman widows. Because if you think like the prospect of like childbirth as a woman in the, you know, 4th century is not a great one. Just the mortality rate and all of that. So like these men would die and the women would just run the estate. They're not going to remarry. They have as much power as they could ever possibly get. Melania, there are 2 famous Melanias that financed a lot of these monasteries. But Evagrius he was a kind of up and coming, I think, official. And he had an affair with a married woman, and one of the widows is like, just, I'll finance your trip from what's now Turkey to Egypt. You can go be a monk there. Bye. And he's a weird guy because he really likes clothes. He actually, like, sin means a lot to him, and he comes up with the 8 deadly sins. And you know the 7, but the 8th one is Acidia, which is like specific to monks. That's why it didn't get kind of kicked over with the other 7 and in the movie with like Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. But it's also kind of like very writerly and scholarly, where it's like the idea is, they call it the Noonday Demon, and you kind of see that kicked around sometimes now. I think they're like, occasionally I'll see like an essay titled that, or a poem titled that. But you get up, you've done your first like morning round of prayer, and now it's noon. And I think of it as kind of like when you've caffeinated in the morning and then you're kind of over caffeinated and you despair. And so for John Cashin in his Institutes describes it like, you get up, you go to the edge of your cell, you stare out the window, you imagine a life that you might have had if you didn't become a monk. You think about old beefs with people back in the city, and you think about how your life bears no spiritual fruit, that feels very writerly, honestly.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that kind of torments Dan in the novel, right? Because he has this kind of like a lot of regret and pain.
Yeah.
That's one, like, I don't need like advice on like, well, maybe I need advice on sloth, but I need like spiritual guidance through Acidia, I think, more than like wrath or something, you know, like that's where I need the help. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. For me, it's not noon. It's like 2 to 4. That's my least favorite time of day.
That's a rough time.
Yeah, and like I feel like when I was a kid in my 20s, like there was this sort of lore of people being morning people or night people, and like at some point I was like, I like mornings and nights. Those are both like excellent times. Like it's like the middle of the day that sucks.
Yeah.
Like,
and the weird borders of the day are kind of exciting because they're charged by like sleep and mystery, you know, like darkness is like, oh, there's something out there.
Yeah, there's that transitional magic, and you can like drink stimulants and it's appropriate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And depressants later on.
Yeah. Okay, well,
like oh yeah, do we have more questions? Okay.
We do, yeah. Are you ready for them?
Sure, go for it.
Let's see. So Jared is reading Via Negativa now. I'm really loving it. Can you talk about how long it took you to write your first draft and how the book changed from draft to draft?
Yeah. It started out, because I read that Nabokov did this, that he wrote like Lolita on index cards. And I like the like portability of index cards. Like you just put a few in your pocket, you go for a walk, sit down somewhere, and you can kind of fill out 1 or 2 of them. And so I had all of them. And like, you know, it's like the Fanny Howe Catholic piece. It's like 2 or 3 sentences in this kind of like loose paragraph. I like the shape of it, and even the way, like how, like the way it looks on the page, I guess. And so I started writing, and you know, I was like, okay, this coyote thing can kind of pull me through. It's like a dreamy image I can return to. And so I would have stuff, I'd write like, okay, what does he think about the Desert Fathers? What does he think about Thomas Merton? I would get like a little arc for something that he did when he was at the minor seminary as a teen. And then slowly those, like, as I would enter them into the computer, I could shuffle them around, reorder them, glue them together. Like, there is this kind of like fetish for really atomized novels.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that, you know, like Jenny Awful, and I feel like even like Maggie Nelson's influence just on fiction. But, and some of the atomized stuff I think is incredible. I'm not trying to denigrate it or anything. But sometimes like I realize like they didn't need to just float in space. They could kind of glue together and talk to each other and have some sympathetic vibration between like, okay, well, he's thinking about oblates. Well, maybe he'll talk about the minor seminary. And so I could glue them together, and it slowly kind of fused into a more conventional novel than the like atomized postcard thing or index card thing. Yeah, and so just slowly, it kind of like ossified so that the different little plates just kind of fused.
Yeah, I remember reading about the last novel that Nabokov was working on before he died was, I think he did that index card method a lot, but it was still just like totally disconnected random fragments and a stack of cards, and they decided to publish it.
Oh God.
Like he would have hated it, you know,
I'm
like
sure.
it was just
I'm
this
sure.
like garbage my novel.
Oh my God.
And like everybody hated it, but like he would have especially hated it.
Oh man. For you, like with the Unreality of Memory, was it the thing where you were like working on the weekends start to finish, or did you have any kind of like, what's a fragment? What's the basic unit for the Unreality of Memory?
Yeah, so whenever I'm writing poetry, I always feel like I have to find like a form that I can sort of mold all whatever little like images or ideas and thoughts and lines I have. I can kind of be like, well, this is the form I'm working in now. And it's small enough, because poems tend to be small, that I can sort of like force myself to write one, like depending on what kind of timeline I'm working on, like once a week or once a month or whatever. And I can just be like, well, at least I don't have to figure out a brand new form, which I do kind of do with each book, but at least like for this poem, I don't have to figure that out. I'm going to work within the form that I've been working in, and just kind of like start with whatever little bit I have, like the last couple of like interesting ideas or images that I kind of floated through my mind while I was going for a walk or something this week. And that helps me a lot to just sort of be like sticking somewhat into a formula in a way. And usually it kind of changes and evolves over the course of the book, so the poems don't actually all look the same. Okay. But just kind of removing one variable. It's like if you're like, well, I only write sonnets, so if I'm going to write a poem, I got to write a sonnet.
Right.
But yeah, so it's like, so for the Self Unstable, there were these little kind of paragraphs, and that was helpful for me because I was having to write a lot for work at the time. I was like a copywriter, and being in prose mode all day, I found like I had like forgot how to think in lines or in verse. So I was like, the only way I'm going to write poetry is if I write it in prose in some fashion or another. So I started writing these little prose blocks.
And then gradually, I mean, because it's like, I feel like there's like a lot of structure in both in The Word Pretty and the Unreality of Memory, like in the essays themselves, the way they kind of like, some feel more like this, or some like some are kind of like you'll have two kind of bounce between different threads and then tie them, obviously.
Yeah, I love structure, but I feel like it always just sort of just emerges. It's like an emergent property of material. Like if you work on something enough, like the structure emerges, and or at least like I can see it, like it just starts to appear to me like a constellation.
Right, like it's like the thing that you're working on will present a form after a while. Like you will discover its kind of topography or whatever.
Yes.
I had something like that with Via Negativa, where I was like, how do I justify, and this goes back to Jared's question a little bit, but like, how do I justify the retrospective kind of mode? And I wanted, so it's like, how do you, because it's like he's going to touch on the same events. So I created a kind of like, if you imagine like a map where the cardinal points are events in his life, the narrative kind of like, okay, he's passing the minor seminary, he's passing Paul, and then he passes it, but you're getting a little more information. And then you kind of get to like the heart of the maze, and that's where things are kind of like revealed to you in a kind of labyrinth. But I like found that like I'd already had the labyrinth section in the book, and I was like, oh, that is that's the shape I need. And like, does it strictly adhere to that? Maybe not 100%, but it gave me enough to kind of go forward. So that it's like, okay, like the negativity, right, the kind of denial can slowly like collapse when you get to the heart of stuff, you know.
Have you read The Rings of Saturn?
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah, the labyrinth thing. Yeah, I just thought of that. So I feel like we have time for like one more questions, and the last two Q&A questions are related, and that's also the last question I wanted to ask you. So I feel like it's just synchronicity. So basically questions around Bede, who's like the coyote that, you know, in the very first sentence, but I'm pronouncing it right, I hope, Bede, the Venerable Bede. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So in the very first sentence of the novel, you know, Dan's driving, and like there's a coyote that gets hit on the road in front of him, and so he pulls over and he picks up this coyote, and that's his kind of road trip companion for most of the book until, you know, kind of towards the end. I don't want to give it away, no spoilers.
Right.
But so, you know, he's like, you know, kind of the other main character in the book, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So one of the questions was, could you expand upon the choice of name? One was sort of like, how does the wildness of Bede move Father Dan's journey? I love the way that's phrased. So maybe you could just kind of talk in general about Bede and his role in the book.
Sure. This will sound kind of dorky, but so like my family used to live in Kansas. I was like at my folks' house, and I went on a run, and it's in the Flint Hills, so it's not like the flat part, you know, because you live in Colorado, so you kind of know, like, if you're driving out, it's like there's a part of Colorado that's incredibly boring too. At least flat. I don't want to totally deride it, but this, you know, the eastern third of the state is like very beautiful, these rolling hills. So I was running in some like prairie, and I just like surprised these two coyotes, and they were really lanky. They had these long legs, and this, I don't know, it's just like my brain was like, I just felt like I was being seen. You know what I mean? Like I was like looked at and regarded as an, like, I don't know, there was an intelligence at work there that really startled me. And then I like, you know, I'd learned more about coyotes. I read Barbara Kingsolver's The Prodigal Summer, which she has a lot about coyotes in there when I was in college. And what I like about coyotes is like, if you 23andMe a coyote, you're going to get like 45, 55, maybe 60% coyote DNA. And then the rest, the like last fourth, third, maybe 40% is domesticated dog and wolf DNA. And they fill these different, you know, ecological niches. But I like that they kind of just defy speciation as we know it, you know, that they exist between these other species. They're adaptable to like human company in these weird ways. Despite us, they thrive in cities. They thrive in places where, you know, wolves have been eradicated by humans. And I like that slipperiness of them. Because, you know, that is some Via Negativa shit. You know what I mean? Where it's like, they aren't fully known by us or fully contained in the category of coyote, whatever that means. Yeah, so that kind of drew me in. And so I've always had a kind of interest in them. And I realized like just the image of like a priest and a coyote in a car was dreamy enough for me to kind of return to it. And I wanted to kind of like probe it and be like, and the coyote for me also balances out the kind of spirituality of the book, because it's an animal that has to eat, has to shit. You know, it can't just like, he cleans out its, you know, carrier several times in the book, like you would have to. And it helped me cantilever some of the woo-woo stuff, because he has to like actually like deal with the logistics of this animal. He even drugs it, you know, with his own kind of medication. and that kind of links them in a way for me. Yeah.
Cantilever is a good word. Yeah. And like the growing stench in the car is like,
Yeah.
it becomes this symbol for like, just, you know, Father Dan, like living with his own guilt for all
and
this time.
it kind of like marks him as, you know, like one of the little motifs, a prairie wizard.
Yeah.
In the book, you know, he becomes wilder. The coyote doesn't really become tame.
I love that. Well, we are about at time. So do you have any final closing remarks?
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks to Jeff and Magic City. And pick up a copy of The Unreality of Memory while you're at it out there, people who are tuning in, our friends.
Buy Dan's book if you haven't already. It's something that we didn't really talk about, but I just want to say is it's really funny. Like,
oh, thanks.
It's a really funny book. Like you will LOL. So it's.
That's the thing where you're like, because it's like, there's a lot of mystical stuff. There's a lot of kind of like religious history, but it's like, I didn't want to make something that was just kind of all like gooey and like, you know, Super Soul Sunday. I mean, I love Oprah personally. Don't get me wrong, but I didn't want it to be like. So yeah, thank you for pointing. That's sweet.
Well, I loved reading it. I hope if anyone here hasn't read it, they will buy it and read it. And thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to us. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks all of you for tuning in. And if you can, you know, get your if you haven't bought it yet, get your books from Magic City Books in Tulsa.
100%.
They do so many different events. I think they have Margaret Atwood coming up, he said. Like, so support them and support your local bookstores.
All right. Good night, folks.
Thanks again.